A new poll has showed that 57% of British people think that immigration is a top political issue, and 57% is the highest ever recorded for immigration as a top political issue. And it also means that immigration is now officially the top political issue in British politics. Now, this is quite a change. Immigration hasn't always been a top political issue. For years it was the economy or the NHS that was at the top. And whilst those things are important, obviously, seems like people are starting to realise that all of the other political issues, economy, NHS, unemployment, low wages, everything, it can all be traced back to immigration in some way. We would have less unemployment if there weren't so many foreigners competing with British people for jobs. We would have higher wages if there weren't so many foreigners depressing wages by accepting low paid work. We would have less crime because foreigners commit crimes at like twice the rate of British people do. We would have a better NHS, not only because there would simply be less people in the country, but also because a lot of foreigners tend to marry their cousins, which means that those people that are the product of cousin marriage have to use the NHS more often. And it's also been found that foreign doctors are like 50% more likely to be suspended from the NHS for malpractice than British born doctors. So there clearly is a link between every other political issue and immigration, especially with housing. Housing is the most obvious one. If you have millions of people entering into a country every year, it's obviously going to push the price of housing up. Now, left-wing people would say, oh, you're just blaming immigrants. The real problem is the 1%. The real problem is landlords. And it's like, leftists are never able to explain why you can't blame both. Obviously, for example, foreign companies buying up houses as soon as they come on the market and then reselling them at a higher price, that obviously is a political issue, and doing that would reduce house prices. But no left-wing person that brings that up is able to explain to me why we can't ban that and also ban the mass immigration from the third world that's increasing house prices and depressing wages. Can anyone explain that to me? I don't think anyone can. Now, if you're watching this video, then you probably are a nationalist. You probably know that immigration is the top political issue in the country. So it is good to see that the general public are finally catching up to this. People are finally starting to realise how important immigration is. And we also need to make people know that other people think like them, which is why I'm really happy to see the Operation Raise the Colours campaign, where people are putting up English and British flags all over the country. Because, if you believe that immigration should be reversed, it might make you think, you might think that no one else seems to think that. I've said this before, but there's definitely been situations where an employee has said something racist, and they will have been investigated by their company, and their company might have had a meeting to discuss this racist employee. And during this meeting, you might have 5 executives that all agree with the so-called racist post, but none of them are willing to say to each other that they agree with it. So they're all saying, oh yeah, this employee needs to be fired because they're racist. But in their head, they're thinking that they actually agree with it. And everyone else in that meeting is also agreeing with it. That's definitely happened. And one of the good things about this Operation Raise the Colours campaign is that even though it might seem pointless, especially because sometimes people will just take the flags down, it's making people aware that other people think like them, and that's really important. Now, there is a common phrase that a lot of people say. I think Steve Laws popularised it, and that is, remigration is inevitable. Now, I don't actually think that it's inevitable. There is a possibility that we lose our country. There is a possibility that thousands of years of British history will just end up in the bin and it'll be gone. But what I think that phrase is trying to get at is the idea that as the share of the population that is foreign increases, you have more and more ethnic shocks, and it makes more people aware that they're being replaced, which results in increased support for remigration. Now, an ethnic shock would be something like the Southport attacks. It would be the Manchester Arena bombing. You know, ethnic shocks are when an ethnic minority commits a serious crime that shocks the nation. Now, as the share of the population that's foreign increases, these ethnic shocks are just going to happen more often. You know, it's a statistical certainty. And what these shocks do is that they radicalize people. I mean, you know, after Southport, you had, you know, days of protests and riots from, you know, people up and down the country. You know, after Southport, immigration as a political issue had a huge spike. You know, you had, yes, Keir Starmer initially was saying how he's going to lock people up, but now he's talking about deportations. He said that we're becoming an island of strangers. You know, Southport really changed the political debate. And so if more of them happen, which will happen as the share of the population that's foreign increases, people will become more anti-immigration. It's also the fact that as the foreign share, specifically the non-white share of the population increases, when people just go about their lives, they'll notice the change in population. I mean, for example, in the 1970s, the National Front wanted to deport all non-whites. Most people actually agreed with it at the time, but I think the main reason why they didn't get many votes was because most people just didn't have to interact with non-whites. People didn't see it as an issue. You know, people thought, you know, imagine being a National Front activist and telling someone that one day British people will be on the verge of becoming a minority. People would have just not believed you at all. So, whereas now you've got Reform, a party that is perceived to be anti-immigration, even if it isn't, that's first in the opinion polls, because whenever someone goes out and about, they see non-white people, and if someone were to say that, oh yes, one day British people are going to be a minority, people would actually be able to believe it. You know, like, talking about immigrant crime, you know, for a long time, that's just seemed like a hypothetical for a lot of people. But now people know what it's like. People will read in the local news about immigrant crime. People will hear from people about how they've been the victims of immigrant crime. People will go to school, and, you know, I'm quite young. I've finished school not long ago, and I can tell you from first-hand experience that non-white children are overrepresented when it comes to kids that have behaviour issues and so on, and all of the statistics reinforce that. So if you're a, you know, young British person, you'll know what they're like simply by going to school with them. That's not to say that all non-white people are bad, or that all non-white people have behaviour problems, but as a percentage, there is a difference. And so that's why people say that remigration is inevitable, because as the share of the population that's foreign increases, support for remigration amongst the native population will also increase, simply because immigration is a political issue. Now, there is a window where remigration could occur, because, you know, a pro-remigration government is not going to be elected when British people are 20% of the population, even if 100% of British people support remigration. So it's about, you know, the window is really when British people are between probably 55 to 65% of the population. You know, you probably could go down to as low as 50% or 45%. I mean, some people say that as soon as we become 49% of the population, it's over. You know, I don't agree with that. The way to carry out remigration is to have the state under your control, and to win an election, you only need about a third of the vote. And, you know, turnout amongst British people is a lot higher than turnout amongst foreign people. So it's not over once we become the minority, but around, probably 50 to 60% of the population is the best time for remigration. So, you know, time's running out, but it's not over entirely. Some people say that once we become a small minority, Britain's going to erupt into a civil war. You know, that's a strong possibility, I think. But you also have to consider that even when we do become the minority, we're going to be the largest minority for a very long time. We've got a good chance of winning that civil war. So it's not over till it's over. It's not over until the last British person takes their final breath. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, then please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, follow me on Twitter, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.